Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is section 6.6, and we're looking at the political scene in the 18th century, some political happenings up until the year 1763. So we're going to go through that, and this is, again, basically the culmination of Unit 6. And it's really not things that necessarily have anything to do with the Enlightenment, but it's basically time period things that we throw in here to around the same time chronologically. So it's going to be several mismatched things, but all of them really are pushing toward this idea that these countries in this mercantilist world are hyper competitive, and one little area or target or place is going to cause war, conflict, and you see that going into the 18th century. So let's go, let's ride, let's see what we got. Alright, so first of all, we're going to do some British things. What happens after the Glorious Revolution. And if you remember, Glorious Revolution in the year 1689 or 8, one of the two. Let's go with 9. Certainly the English Bill of Rights right around that time as well, when William and Mary were ushered in to become the new joint monarchs of England, replacing James II. So with our British friends here, all very, very British people, except Mike Myers, who's Canadian, and, well, I guess the rest of them are. So maybe one of One Direction is Israeli? I don't really know. Nor do I care. Alright, so first of all, I'm sorry, the formatting is a little jumpy. The font really gave me problems, so some of the font is pretty small. But in any case, you got William and Mary, and then they die, and then there's Anne, who is the sister of Mary, the youngest daughter of James II. She rules for a while, but doesn't have any kids, doesn't get married. It's like the other Virgin Queen, I guess. I don't know. She might have been married. I don't really care. But she did, and then there's no heir. So the Stuart House, which is your Jameses, your Charleses, your English Civil War, that period of time, 17th century, they're out. So we had Tudor and Stuart, and now we're going to go over to the Hanover House. The Hanovers were actually cousins of the Stuarts, but they're German. They're German nobles. They're a German family in northern Germany. And the oldest one was named George. So George is invited to become the new king of England, which he does. But here's the thing. George I and George II, neither of them speak English. So how are you going to have an English king that doesn't even speak English? I don't know, but they did. That's the way it worked. So basically what we're going to see is that, as was kind of triggered by the 17th century with Petition of Rights, Civil War, Glorious Revolution, Parliament gets even more and more influence when they deal with a king who can't even speak the language. So it's really going to mark another huge progression into the king's power. And in that period of time, what we start to see is the evolution and the creation of a cabinet system. Basically, your cabinet is very similar to what we see today in the United States. It's a series of ministers who kind of get things done. They have certain areas in which they go about doing their business. And the Prime Minister, which was a member of the majority house in Parliament, typically led the cabinet. And Robert Walpole, who is this jolly fellow right here, Walpole is going to be the first real significant prime minister, helping out with George I and George II in the years 1721 to 1742. He's going to be in the position of power. And what you see over time, and what we're going to see now from really now on, is that your prime minister is going to be your head government figure in England. It's not the king anymore, and this marks a big change, a huge change. Because from now, or from the beginning to now, really, the king, the queen, those are the ones heading up politics in the country. They may be the only one that heads up politics. But now in England, we have this guy named a prime minister who's going to be in significant power. So Robert Walpole and his dashing eyebrows, I mean, look at those things. Look at that. It's incredible. He is going to really lead the way. Because, in part, his kings that he serves in England, they don't know what's going on. Half the time the Georges are back in England, or back in Germany rather, attending to matters there. So again, cabinet system in England really takes the lead. And then one other thing concerning England, real quick. 1707, you have an act called the Act of Union, which incorporates Scotland, which basically was in an economic trouble point by this point. It incorporates Scotland into the United Kingdom and creates what we know today as Great Britain. Scotland, desiring economic advantages at the time to being united with England, unites and again creates Great Britain. So the British flag that we see in my classroom and on this slide is designed basically from the countries of England and Scotland. If you notice on the flag, the English flag is just the red cross, and the Scottish flag is the one behind with the blue X. I guess there's a white X on a blue background, but whatever. So again, the act of union is there to basically unite the two. So we're really going to be referring to England as Great Britain from now on, because it's basically representing what's happening there on the British Isles. So there we go, a little British stuff, kind of tying the knot, and we're really going to go away from Britain for a little while because they get involved in that little thing over in the colonies, which really isn't as pertinent to our class as perhaps another one you will take next year, AP US History. If you've taken AP US History, you know that idea already, you know that story. Or US History, or any sort of American history. You're good to go. All right, so that leads us to 18th century wars. Not much more to say. Okay, so again, we have talked a lot about mercantilism and how that economic idea really drove not only economic decisions but political decisions of these countries. For instance, you have maybe this island which you try to probably, get into and try to take over. For instance, the reason why you want it, again, maybe a resource there. Maybe they make scrambled eggs, or maybe they make jump ropes, or maybe they make chickens. I don't know. Doesn't matter. But again, resources lead to wealth. Wealth leads to power. And that leads to a lot of competition between these countries. We've talked at length about the War of Spanish Succession before. Cause a possible Bourbon succession to the throne in which Charles II, the Habsburg king, Jewel Boy as I call him, dies and names the grandson of Louis XIV as his heir. Well, a fight happens, everyone gets mad at France for trying to trigger this French domination. And the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 is going to help England take really control of the Atlantic economy, along with allowing the Bourbon King in Spain. We've told that story. We haven't told the one which is the War of Jenkins' Ear, which is a fun tale in which Spain, which is definitely losing out at this point, are complaining their transports and their trade ships going from the Atlantic or through the Atlantic from the New World to the Old World. They complain that the British are sending mercenaries, or yes, she meant pirates, to basically take over and smuggle goods back and front across the Atlantic. The Spanish are really getting a little sensitive about that. So, of course, it would be not surprising that the Spanish stop a British troop, and the Spanish troop goes in and cuts the ear off British captain named Mr. Jenkins. Robert Jenkins, I believe his name was. This war really doesn't do anything to anybody. It's just significant in terms of, again, economic policy driving a war, in this case, the dominance of the Atlantic Ocean. So the British win. It really is no big deal in terms of the war. But isn't it nice to know that a war once started because somebody's ear got cut off? Just a nice little tidbit of fact that you can take along your way. But again, another example of this mercantilist philosophy of if I don't got it, somebody else does, and that means they have power. And good Lord at this point knows that Spain is looking to get all the help they can get. Okay, so meanwhile, this is probably more of a significant tale. And in terms of these wars, I'll just be, flat out honest with you. You're never really going to have to, especially these, or this war in particular, you're never probably going to have to, argue or totally explain, the happenings, every battle, basically. But just know where it fits in with the larger story, and we'll get to that in a minute. We've talked about Maria Theresa. She becomes the Queen of Austria. Remember, her dad, Charles VI, basically says at the beginning of her reign that, hey, he signed a law that said that the Austrian Empire can never be taken. Well, he dies, Maria becomes queen, and immediately Frederick the Great, who becomes the king of Prussia around the same time, is looking to expand Prussia. And oh, look, typo. So don't call it out, you bunch of crazies. So, Prussia and Austria go to war because Prussia is looking to expand, and Prussia defeats Austria because that's how the world works. We'll learn this later. And then, meanwhile, France and Britain and Spain really too busy to get involved because they're fighting each other at the other side of the world. More on that in a minute. So you have this treaty, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, in which Prussia gains all of this land. They gain an area called Silesia, which I'll show you on a map in just a minute. And basically, this is going to double Prussia's population. This is a huge deal because it makes Prussia into an incredibly powerful German state, much more powerful than Austria, and puts Frederick the Great in a position of arguably being the most powerful monarch in Europe at this point because France is starting to slide a little themselves. So this is a big deal in terms of Prussia gaining power. And basically here you've got, Prussia, which totally it is, it's not small, but at this point it's just this, but bam, you're adding all this down here, and gosh, all those resources, it is crazy. And then Austria basically loses that land. Big deal for them. So and we know right here, this is Poland. Okay, so we know what's going to happen to Poland, right? They're going to let me get my eraser out. They're going to get swallowed up, basically. So all of a sudden, Prussia and their emerging military has their designs on all of this land right here. It's an incredible space that they are carving out for themselves, and Silesia is a big part of that story. And again, this is called the War of Austrian Succession, going back to Maria Theresa becoming queen and the challenges to her immediately out of the gate. So 8 years go by, and Maria Theresa's like, dang, I really miss my Silesia. So she wants to get Silesia back. Now, we talked about how when one country appears to be gaining strength, sometimes others will gang up against it. And that's what you get here. Maria Theresa in Austria gains France and Russia as allies. Now, Russia at this point, by the way, is not ruled by Catherine the Great. She is actually the wife to the Tsar Peter III. More on that in a second. But Maria Theresa, in this 8-year gap between the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle and the 7 Years' War, which is what it will become to be called, she gains France and Russia and said, let's all conquer Prussia and divide their territory. So this triggers what's called, and this is a very minor detail, but it triggers the diplomatic revolution of 1756, which basically brings France and Austria, who long hated one another. Louis XIV had all sorts of problems with those Habsburgs. And if you remember, part of what France wanted to do, always, was to keep Germany divided. And Austria at this point is a German state, possibly part of a united Germany. So France and Austria had always despised one another. But now, because of the emergence of Prussia, France and Austria are like, yep, we better team up so we can put them down. So then, sitting on the outside, very irrelevant that you would think, but still involved, is Britain. And they believe that Britain, whose main rival is France, especially in the New World when it comes to the colonies, Britain believes that Prussia can be a better check. Now, track with me here. Britain believes that Prussia can be a better check on French power on the continent of Europe than Austria can. So again, Britain believes that if Prussia is strong in Europe, it will make France weaker, which means that France will not be as strong in the New World, where Britain is strongest. Okay, follow me? If not, go to rewind. Rewind back, listen to that again. If you don't get it, at this point when you're listening again, do it one more time. And now if you're at this point again, you still don't get it, then I really don't know how to help you. Actually, I do. Ask me some other time. Maybe read your book, consult another history text, call a German friend. I don't know. There are other options. Anyway, let's move on. So, France and Britain continuing to square off something in the New World. trigger what's become known as the French and Indian War. And there's a whole story with George Washington there I'm not going to get into. But, again, basically you have fighting all over the world. And this is what becomes known as the 7 Years' War. The European part is usually known as the 7 Years' War. In the New World, it's known as the French and Indian War. But the French and Indian War was primarily between France and Britain. All of these countries were basically involved with the 7 Years' War. Okay? So there we go. So the 7 Years' War was basically, it was pretty ugly. I mean, it was a bloody war, 7 years. It was the bloodiest war in Europe since the 30 Years' War, which was like a century before. And Prussia is hopelessly outnumbered in this thing because Britain's really not helping out much on the continent. They're mostly focused on the New World. Prussia is outnumbered 15 to 1. They suffer 180,000 dead, endless disruptions, near death, going to be ugly. And then, inexplicably, the Russian Tsar Peter III pulls Russia out of the war. Peter III himself was actually a friend of Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia, and did not want Frederick to suffer. So he pulls Russia out of the war, which totally breaks up Austria's plan of trying to take Frederick the Great and try to take Prussia down. Side note, by the way, when Peter III pulls Russia out of the war, many nobles, boyars in Russia are mad and then conspire with the Tsarina, Catherine the Great, to have Peter assassinated. And voila, it happens. But again, that's basically 7 Years' War. So after that withdrawal, Prussia is able to hang on, and they are able to evade disastrous defeat. Which leads us to 1763 and what's known as the Treaty of Paris. Treaty of Paris, considered the most important treaty since Westphalia in 1648, ends the 7 Years' War, basically gives Prussia Silesia, which they retain. You probably could call the war a draw by this point, by the way. France, though, is going to, because in the French and Indian War, they do lose. They're going to lose all their colonies in North America to Britain, especially those, up in that region called Canada, Southwest Southwest colonies at this point, over near the Gulf states. So they lose all of that. Now, the significance, this is what's important of the Treaty of Paris. 1, Prussia's strength is solidified. It looked like Prussia might be destroyed out of this. They emerge out of the war as a solid, independent German state that is powerful in Central Europe. And then, most importantly, I believe, Britain really emerges as the powerhouse. Whereas France, a century before, was the powerful state, with this defeat and the Treaty of Paris, Britain becomes numero uno. Number 1, GB. That's right. So, that's basically the 18th century for you in terms of the political scene. Again, big things to understand. The continual evolution of the British political system, how the cabinet position and the prime minister were most powerful. And then, again, I would understand probably the pretext for the 7 Years' War, how Austrian Succession was the key there. And then understand maybe the significance here of the Treaty of Paris, in which Prussia's strength solidified and Britain becomes the powerhouse. Key ideas there. But the bigger idea, the bigger picture even of that, is that, again, mercantilism drives so many actions between these countries, where these trading empires trigger everything. Because, again, if you don't have the resources, you don't have the wealth, you don't have the power, you're screwed. That's basically it. That's as simple as I can draw it up for you. I hope you have a pleasant evening wherever you're listening, whenever you're listening, and I will see you on the other side.